where we don't know when we show up actually live, but the platform says it's live. Thanks, Restream, for doing that for us. And thanks, YouTube and LinkedIn, for allowing us to use Restream to get to each of these platforms. Now, today we are talking about culture on the BOLd Business Podcast, and this is a live stream that is setting up and completely complimentary to our podcast that will come out later this month. With me today are Steve and Tony, and I have to say, you're in the right place today for the conversations on how to increase your own capacity as well as the capacity of your leadership team. Because we're talking about the skills not only we need, but that our companies need to have a resilient business. To discuss this with me, I've already mentioned Steve and Tony, and they are going to introduce themselves. Steve, tell us a little bit about you.
Great to be with you, Jess. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. So right now, I'm in your future for most of you in the US, or all of you in the US. Look, I've been working in the workplace culture space for more than 30 years now. So that's where I've directed all my energies and where I do most of my thinking, Jess.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I'm glad you're here today from our future, Steve. And Tony, who is just an hour ahead of me in Boulder, Colorado, out in Central Time. Tell us a little bit about you.
So I'm a serial engineer. I built a lot of different interesting things with computers over the years, particularly towards the internet. And I predominantly landed in the space of communications. So I make a lot of technology that allows people to communicate instantly and live over long distances. And so when we started a company, we chose to make it fully remote in order to continue that tradition. So I have a lot of background in trying to work with people I don't meet until 5 years after I first encounter them.
Isn't that amazing? Thank you, Tony, for that. I know. And the power of technology gets to bring us together in 3 different places globally to have a conversation today. And like you, there are many people that I know by chat room, email, or direct message way longer before I even see them on video. Even today, that could happen. And then, of course, to your point, seeing them in person is a whole other ball game that gets to come together, that we can increase our connection and increase our collaboration without having to travel the globe quite as far. But I must admit, each of you live in pretty cool places that, and as do I live in a very cool place that allows us to really anchor in and bring the best of who we are to the table. And I'm your host with that. I will tell you that I'm Jess Duell. I'm a strategic business advisor at Red Direction, where we're providing customizable and unique frameworks specifically geared to building resilience in companies. So by listening in today, maybe you'll find the right question to ask to move your business forward. Maybe you'll be able to think more effectively on your feet the next time you find yourself in a pressure cooker situation. That's what these conversations, as we have them over time, are all about. Now, speaking of, let's just dig right in. I have asked Steve and Tony to answer this question for us, and we're going to hear the answers to their questions, and then we're going to talk about their answers. All right, Steve, what are significant everyday actions that improve a company's culture?
Jess, a tough question to answer in 2 minutes, really tough. Look, I think there's 2 parts, and the first part is, I think, leaders need to gain real clarity around what workplace culture really means. I think there's a paradox in that culture is talked about a lot, increasingly, I think, in recent years. But the paradox, I think, is that few people understand culture in simple and practical terms. So I've developed the concept of UGRs, unwritten ground rules, which I define as people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. And they can include things like, at our meetings, it isn't worth complaining because we know nothing will get done. The only time anyone gets spoken to by the boss is when something is wrong, and so on. These drive people's behaviour, yet they are seldom talked about openly. It's the unwritten ground rules, or UGRs, that constitute the company's culture. So tip number 1 would be tune into and think through what are the UGRs in your team, in your organisation. So that's tip number 1. The second tip is And I draw on this after having worked with the leadership team a little while back, where I asked them this question. I think this is a vital question for all leaders. The question I put to this leadership team was this: if I went to your people and they're being candid and open and honest, and you leaders are not in the room, but your people are and I'm with them, how would they answer this question? What are your leaders' top 3 priorities? Now, I don't know about you, but I think that is a fascinating question to ponder. And I'd love to do that survey in any organisation, because I suspect that culture or people or values or some synonym thereof would not appear in the top 3 priorities. So the question is this for leaders, and this is the second tip: make a decision about whether or not culture or people or values is a genuine top 3 priority. Because if it's not, stop using the term, because you know what? You're probably doing more damage by spruiking the word culture and it not being a priority than if you didn't use the word at all. Make a serious decision. Is it a priority? And if it is, then you need to reflect on, now, what are the questions that we could be asking our people that will demonstrate culture is a top 3 priority? I think they're vital, Jess. I think that's my 2 minutes too.
I think they are vital, and we're going to get to dig into those a little bit more. And Tony, I want to hear from you. What are significant everyday actions that improve a company's culture?
So I think the first one is identifying the source of the culture, because it comes off like Steve was just saying, like, you just can tell the word culture a lot without really understanding it. But in some ways, it's like holding a scepter. Like, you have this magic scepter, and like, you'll be surprised to see how much influence you actually have on people. Like, it just flows in an interesting way that you don't really understand until you see it happening, because you're just like, oh, I'm doing my own thing, whatever. And all of a sudden you're noticing maybe there's someone in your company who has certain behaviors, and then, oh, look, everybody that works for them is like a little mini version of that person now. So like, it kind of just happens naturally. So paying attention to that, I think it's important. Like, where is the culture coming from, so that you can be sure that if you're actually trying to influence it, that's a good spot to start from, because that's the key point where everyone will kind of follow after it. And then I think the other one is probably giving people an opportunity to voice their mind. Sometimes we don't make people afraid to hide in the corner and like don't want to say something that might not be the most popular opinion, because no one's going to come and offer that to you unless you almost got to pry it out of them sometimes, because people just naturally don't want to tell you the stuff. And like, you'll only learn about it on their exit interview, which is less useful.
So true. So true. And let's talk about that natural piece, because it ties in not only to what you were saying, Tony, but also, Steve, to what you were talking about too. The point being, having a process to understand and hear what people have to say in a psychologically safe way. And I think we all kind of get the concept of the first part, yet we fall a little short when it comes to the implementation. So we say we have such and such a policy. We say we can talk about certain things, yet nobody does those UGRs that Steve has identified. And so I'd like to spend a couple of minutes and hear from each of you. What are some, the decision being made, okay, this culture is a priority, understanding where it comes from and the influence and all of that. What are like some of the things that we've got to start with to recognize and be able to evaluate? Do we like the culture we have if we haven't been cultivating it?
Well, Jess, I mean, your question's a really good one, because I think the starting point, if we're going to be serious about culture, the starting point is to gain clarity around our aspirational culture. So leadership teams need to sit down and consider what I think is a vital question. And that question is this: what are the key cultural attributes we need in place for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? Put more simply, the question is, what does our culture need to look and feel like for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? We need clarity around that aspirational culture, and we need commitment to it. And that's where the question about are we serious or not comes into play, because we need then to ask ourselves, are we serious about fighting for this aspirational culture? By the way, I think too often aspirational cultures, which are articulated through values statements, are created simply by people considering the question, so what do we want our values to be? Almost independent of strategic planning, business planning, and all that sort of stuff. So we need to reframe this to be central to our success while making it a great place to work. Once we gain clarity around that aspirational culture, collectively we all need to fight for it. There's no doubt that leaders need to take the primary role here, but we collectively should be fighting for this aspirational culture. There's some tough decisions that need to be taken in doing that, if we're serious about it.
Yeah, I believe it's kind of the other thing is that culture goes both ways. So you can create bad ones just as easily as good ones. So it's interesting to see where you have to kind of take the behavioral patterns and separate them out, because it can be like, that it's a given, but they always say lead by example. Like that's one thing that makes a big difference, because like if certain people in a company maybe feel like they don't have to do stuff that other ones do, then it creates this, well, I'm not doing it either kind of thing. Or like you can, if they see the boss it's like jumping in, and they'll just learn to do that same thing. And like I was saying before, it's kind of interesting like how intricate that is. Like you can almost control it like at a micro level, because like you can fix it really quickly too. You can break it really quickly. It's like really kind of takes a lot of work, because any one thing can set everybody off. Like people, I think being online with our company is even kind of different. It might be like there's a whole different kind of politics than an in-person office, because you would go like to the water cooler or out to lunch or something. But like in the online world, everybody is sort of either in a meeting with each other on video or chatting or something. And there's more of a, people are off in different corners and stuff. And so you have to try harder to force group communication than you would just naturally get normally. So yeah, there's kind of like a lot of reflection that has to be done in order to kind of figure out how to keep tuning it. It's not something that just runs on autopilot. It's basically like one sentence can break everything in some cases.
Thinking about reflection, how often do you prioritize that in your business, Tony? The reflection specifically around culture?
Pretty much in the back of my head constantly.
Yeah.
Still haven't mastered the art of doing it perfectly, but I think about it all the time, because like I try and pay attention to the things that are the most maybe like trigger points that will shift things one way or another. But this day and age, it's been kind of like a cool transition, more progressive angle in what we would have called HR before. So one thing I wanted to build in SignalWire is to not have the HR be like the principal's office, just a place you go when you're in trouble or when you're trying to get your insurance fixed, but like give them more of the role of being around for those things to help with that. Like that's like a role that I think it suits them very well, because they're kind of a neutral force that represents all of the employees. So that's one of the things I've been trying to hope for, is to build that up. We're a brand new startup, so we only have so much resources, but we're getting there where I want to put more effort into that, so that we have I'll think about it all the time, but I also want to have, someone have my back on thinking about it all the time to remind me in case I stop thinking about it. Because like I said, like from my position, some of my actions are probably more powerful than any, because people are just going to see what I do, and I want to make sure that I'm sending the right message.
Who has your back? That is a huge, huge statement. And I know not only in the startup world, Tony, businesses of every stage have to think about that. Who has my back? And those other people have to also be thinking about who has my back. And if we're the ones asking the question, that's really cool. If the other people are asking the question, it's really cool when we are the answer, is it not?
Yes. And also, if you think about it, like you have this, you're creating a startup. So you just gather people and say, we're going to do some crazy thing like Don Quixote, attacking the windmills. And like it starts out like a pretty scary adventure. And you have to build up, teamwork. And there's all these stages that people go through and they're all new. Building culture happens in a couple spots. One is like when they're all new, nobody trusts each other. There's like these stages you have to go through where they get together and they start trusting each other. It takes a long time. And then it trusts each other to go in a different lanes so they can expand. And then if you say like get to a bigger spot in your life where you acquire another company or something, you start all over again because now you're like mixing together two of them and then it breaks everything over. So we're at the first stage where we're just getting, everyone getting our feet off the ground. We don't have everyone with 8 different jobs anymore. We're going across the second tier. Now we're at Series B. So we're hitting a point where we're giving people more of a like dedicated positions instead of like you're in charge of these 12 different things. And depending on which one's more important today, you have to switch between them and like work with everybody. And you don't have any certain relationships or, so that transforms into kind of more of a people just trusting each other. That includes like delegating, you make somebody a manager who used to be the only person, like you are the product department, but now you're in charge of the whole thing. So you have to have more, you get to hire a team and those kinds of things. And then the trust thing comes all over again. And then the dynamic of the culture gets even more complicated because it's flowing through multiple chains of command. So
yeah,
they're all like hard. You have to pay attention to that all the time.
It is an all the time thing. And I see Steve shaking his head because all I heard in that, these critical things of handoffs, the concept of it might not be my job today, but it might be my job tomorrow, but at least it's always my job. And someday it's, well, that one's not what I'm responsible for anymore is what else, so there's that handoff. And then where does that handoff happen where it's not me handing off to myself, it's me handing off to another person. And I think that there are some elements in the way we do things here that can cause problems and things that we should be able to look out for. Right, Steve?
Yeah. And Jess, I think, there's some really positive things from what Tony has just shared. And the fact that he is so conscious about the importance of culture is vital because I think often, particularly in a startup context, the product or service offering is all consuming to the owners of the business, and the culture almost occurs incidentally, and it's a reflection of the owner's or the creator's personal values, and that's, you're either lucky or unlucky to have the values that the owner of the business has in place, right? But Tony's smarter than this and realizes that this is so vitally important and indeed goes through stages. So I can remember working for a family company that had grown. And so there are critical incremental points in the growth of a business. So in a family business, typically what will happen is that the unwritten ground rules or UGRs will be linked to the personal values of the family. But this family business I'm thinking about grew quite dramatically, and it went from 50 to 100 to 250. And when it gets to, when it's getting larger, then it gets more bureaucratic. It has to, because there are more, it just has to. And there are then new UGRs that are created. And so, for example, people don't normally have access to the family as they used to when it was a lot smaller. So again, the culture is vitally important then, and we need to have clarity around that aspirational culture. And leaders need to be sensitive to the UGRs and the culture they're creating. So I'll give you an example, and this is to write on Tony's point, which I think was a really good one. If my value or cultural attribute includes a focus on customers, then that's all very well. But then people will tune into, well, what are leaders saying about customers? And if a leader can be heard talking about customers in a disparaging way after a phone call, then there's a logical UGR that's created, which says, oh, they talk about customer service, but we know it's not really that important. And so people deduce the UGRs in large part from the alignment between what people say, particularly leaders, and what they do. And if there's misalignment, there's a good chance that negative UGRs will occur. I'll give you another example. We might say teamwork is important, right? So we got a sales team, and the top performing salesperson is getting the best results, but they are an absolutely terrible team player, and they're getting recognized for their sales performance. Well, we've got a clash here. Are we for teamwork, or are we for sales performance? Because people will quickly deduce that if the person is being recognized for their sales performance and their teamwork is disregarded or is regarded as irrelevant, then teamwork isn't a priority. So are we serious about teamwork, or are we not? And this is where some really hard decisions need to come into play.
Oh, and those hard decisions are always around the corner. It's when we choose to look at them. And so we may wait until we're in a lot of pain, and we still have to go through a lot of pain to make change. I had somebody describe this to me once as like the bobsled team, if you remember the movie Cool Runnings, okay? Where every single time you ran that path, it just was grooved and it got into your muscle memory. And as soon as you want to change that and make one of those things move differently, it really does take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And it's more than we ever could have expected. We may know it intellectually. We may feel that it's going to happen that way, yet it's going to stretch us and test us and be like, does this really matter? Does this really matter? And I want to hear from both of you. Does it really matter to take that time?
I think so. I mean, it's kind of like the analogy you could bring is like diets or changing, like, oh, I should do my dishes more often or something like that. Like, you can always say that when you realize that you should, but then like you fall back into it. Like I'm on a diet now. I'm not going to eat like horrible stuff anymore. And then one day it's like, well, next time I'll do that. So it's like habit breaking issues like that are just compounded in a company, because it's like, it's hard to push that way because it takes a lot of effort. So you have to figure out how to do it. And some advice I got, reading around books and stuff was like, pick something arbitrary. Like take all the green M&Ms out of my M&Ms. Not similar to that. But
I remember hearing those stories. Right. That's right. Have something to negotiate on.
Yeah, or like something you could easily enforce. Like, we never do this. It's something that like you absolutely would never do anyway. So you just like make it a rule, and then like people start believing that the rules mean something, and then you can kind of get to those other things. But some of them are the harder ones. It's like, if you don't like Chinese food, you could say, we're never going to eat Chinese food in this house again, and it's like easy. But it like starts setting a precedence. But if you do like it, then it's a little harder. If everyone except you likes it, then that's really hard. Right.
That's true. And to tie it back to business, right, that going back to that sales performance person, it is very much, are we doing what we say, or do some people get a pass? And if we can't be consistent for everybody along the way, what is that? Not necessarily the immediate cost, which there is one. It's that long-term cost that I think that really comes into play. And so it's interesting that we started talking about reflection. It's interesting that we have been talking about recognizing that we're talking about not squeaky wheels, not easy opportunities, not low-hanging fruit, but purposefully cultivating a garden to have whatever kind of food we want, to Tony's point, which I love. And then being able to do the other work in the day-to-day as well, because that culture work is always on the business. It's always the thing that can most easily get set aside. I don't have time for that. We have 2 more pressing issues. By the way, that's also your culture, is it not?
100%. 100%.
Yeah, I'm going to be giving 4 talks in the next 2 days. And one of the things I say is, look at what you prioritize. That's what you value. And if you do that in reflection, that is something that I think is incredibly key. And I know that that's, Tony, you're talking about doing that in reflection and the way you're having conversations. And Steve, you're talking about being able to have an external way to identify them, to make sure that they're right, to make strategic change. And so, you know, I would love to have tips from you both about, we already know it takes longer than we ever thought, but the tips to stay steadfast and forge through, because that's actually what we're doing. We are forging a path where no one has been before, because our exact company with our exact people and our exact mission has never existed before.
Jess, I'd say there's 2 parts to this, right? One is, to what extent do leaders in the business truly believe in culture? Now, we did some research a while back, and we stumbled across what I now think is a terrific question. And the question we asked in our research was this: if the culture of your workplace was to become as good as it realistically could, how much improvement would there be on people's performance/productivity? Now, in our research, we gave people a sliding scale. Started at 0, because 0 is a legitimate answer. You might think now the culture realistically is as good as it's going to get. And then we gave 10%, 20%, and then 100% and 100% plus. It was 89% of senior leaders said 20% or more improvement would occur. 58% of middle managers, 6 out of 10 middle managers, said 50% or more improvement would occur. When I asked this face-to-face, typically people come out with an average of around 40%. That's the business case for improving the culture. And I think leaders need to get their heads around that, because leaders sometimes don't make that connection for the business case. So that's part 1. Part 2 is, I honestly believe, and I really believe this to be the case, that the vast majority of employees want to be part of a positive, dynamic, productive, hardworking team. To the extent that they aren't right now, I believe that most of them have given up hope of it being any different. So my point is this: I think if we can collectively have an aspiration for distinguishing ourselves based on our culture, then that's a truly exciting prospect for everyone in the business, where we can make that our point of difference, because so few companies do. And if we can create that vision, then I'd put to you, and it's been my experience, that we can turn the culture, we can transform the culture much more quickly than conventional wisdom says. The conventional wisdom says it takes 3 years to change a culture. I totally disagree with that. I think it can be changed quickly. The challenge then is sustaining it. So we can create momentum, but the challenge is sustaining it. But if we've got commitment from leaders, then we can sustain it. I know that from experience. So I think it really is an exciting prospect for any company to truly distinguish themselves based on their culture.
I agree with you. And, you know, I want to take that a little bit further. I wrote that increased productivity. I had something really smart to say, and it was very clever, and it is now gone. It is in a bubble floating around my office above my head, not in it. So let's see if I can get it back. I was really glad you said that culture doesn't have to take that long to change. That is something that most people don't understand, and you're quantifying it. And I think that that's incredibly important. It did come back. Here it is. So there's there's a movement out there that says culture changes from the ground up, and you can make all of this great disruption within an organization for the better. I agree. However, I also think that there is and I'm saying however, because there's a ceiling to that. It's only going to get so high, and it can't go any higher until somebody from the top, and more than one, the somebodies from above can come down and meet it and bring it the rest of the way. And same with top down. If there is not a belief from the top down, or if it's a flat organization from the center of each of the way that the structure is set up in a flat organization, it's not going to happen. And so my follow-up question to you, Steve, is how many people do you actually need to be able to be the ones to go just to hold it? Because not everybody can hold it and still hold the culture in mind and still go forward and do their jobs. How many lighthouses do we need along this coast to just say, yep, we're on the right track. Yep, here's exactly where you're at. Because I think there needs to be more than one. But I also don't think it needs to be everybody.
No, there definitely needs to be more than one, but there will never be everyone. We will never get everyone.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so it becomes an issue of critical mass. And here's the good news for leaders. As leaders, you are primarily, but not solely, responsible for the culture. I think sometimes leaders take on too much responsibility, which, by the way, gives employees an out. And the out is so many employees sitting down, pointing upwards and saying or thinking, if only they'd fix things up, we'd be okay. Now, frankly, that's where my UGRs concept, I think, has a huge part to play, because once people learn about unwritten ground rules or UGRs, they realise that their personal behaviours contribute to the prevailing culture, and that's vital. We've got to get employees involved in this. So there's no magic number in terms of percentage, but it is about critical mass and getting a sufficient number of people, certainly the leaders, but in addition to that, the opinion leaders amongst employees, getting a sufficient number of them fighting for a more positive culture. My experience is that even the unhappiest people in the business do not want it to be that way. They've merely given up hope of it being any different. We can give people hope, and I've seen the most negative, cynical, skeptical people turn 180 degrees and become total advocates for a more positive, productive culture, which is a really exciting prospect.
Oh, it is. Tony, have you and you're going through this where you went from everybody's wearing whatever hat needs the most attention in the day to a little bit less of that. Have you found some resistance and some needing to have these guideposts and people who will steadfastly say, yep, don't take it back. Yep, keep going forward. Yep, this is what it is now. Have you gotten to that point? And what percentage of people in your organization have that responsibility?
Well, it all comes from direct relationships. People are hard. It's not my favorite pastime, like communicating with people all the time, but you can't just have a memo like, starting tomorrow, we have switched our culture. We're all going to be nicer or something like that. It just doesn't work.
Nope, can't have that.
You kind of have to go. If you're trying to manipulate on purpose, you have two ways. You can just do stuff and everyone will copy you, and it may or may not work. Or you're trying to choose certain things you want culture to be. Then you have to have communication with. You have to talk to the people who are now going to be maybe the middle management or the next tier down, and give them that kind of treatment. You can just do it. You empower them. You know, they're going to have employees, and then they have you. So you try and give guidance and those things. I think it's kind of like everyone does have to want to do it, but it's not as easy as necessarily like the creating it. You can't just.
Have you ever had to deal with? Have you ever had to deal with somebody that didn't have hope anymore?
It happens, yes.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's a matter of patience. Some of these things take longer to kind of happen than others, depending on what the thing is or whatever. So like maybe something, and also as a company, you have to make priorities about what to focus on in general with strategy and stuff. So maybe the thing that's going to fix the culture is going to be a little slow moving, you know, in one of the areas until maybe that department is fleshed out more or something like that. Other times, it might be the easy thing, something everybody wanted to do anyway. And when you start talking about it, everyone jumps and runs with it or whatever. Or maybe some of the stuff, a lot of people are already bought into and they just need to know that it's important. So you have all these different ones. So I think the negative shifts are, you get those quicker. Like, you can't do the positive ones the same way. I wish you could, but you can't just like get on the all hands meeting and go, okay, everyone now likes each other and you're all going to cooperate and be teamwork. But I think that it does help to encourage them during those times, because people do want to know that they have a place and being part of a productive team, like Steve was saying, because you also have to remember in leadership role, especially in a startup, not everybody there is going to work 24 hours a day, because as a founder of the company, you kind of expect that's what you're going to have to do. You have to find balance. So you have to, the further down the chain you get, the more those people are only working because they need a job, but you can still make it a great job for them. There's a difference between that and like going down with the ship. I'm the founder and I'll be the last one here if it takes that, or like, you can't, that culture imposed onto the employees who are just, balancing their family life is not right. So that's the other problem, because you could do that, but then you've got everybody thinking they're on a pirate ship and they have to work as hard as they can or they're gonna get thrown off or whatever. But, so that can happen. That's what it'll turn into. Like, you're just thinking, I'm a startup founder, I'll do whatever it takes, and it will translate to, I'm gonna get fired unless I work 24 hours a day. So
it reminds me of the Goonies, Tony. You made me think of the Goonies, where they all are at the end and they've all got to the pirate ship and they all have to start walking the plank in the cave. It's true. And, if people feel like they must act a certain way. So I really want to spend some time on that. How do you foster open conversations so that the people who might be quiet, when they choose to talk, know they're ready, they are welcome to talk? And on the other side, if a viewpoint is different, how do we encourage that those voices actually are heard and encouraged to speak up? Because that's important for innovation. That's important for productivity. That's important for diversity. I mean, there's so many things out there that particular thing is, I know, at the top of my mind. And so how do we get all of those voices, when they're ready, to know that they are welcome to be speaking up, especially if they're different?
Well, a 1 minute answer, Jess.
Whatever you like.
Here's a revelation. Here's a revelation for leaders, right? Yeah. Just because people are quiet doesn't mean they don't have strong views.
That's right.
Okay. Now, I mean, that is a bit of a revelation. If you really reflect on that, that's a bit of a revelation. Now, so we've got to give everyone the opportunity. And my advice to employees is that you should always be guided by two principles. Always try and be constructive. Always be driven by good intent. Those two principles, I think, are vital. Always try and be constructive. Always be driven by good intent. If they are your key drivers, then speaking up, I put to anyone, will probably not get you into too much trouble. Having said that, we need to give people different forums to share their views. And it might involve getting people to speak in small groups, and then that small group reporting back. It might involve doing a mini survey online where we guarantee people of their anonymity. But we got to model what we want. So we got to be open and transparent with people if we want them to be open and transparent as well. And people will pick up the UGRs about whether this is authentic or not. So, we've got to genuinely seek views, and people will read that, after time at least, as being genuine. So, there's no magic to this, but it is all about what's your intent as an individual leader and collectively as a leadership team.
Mm-hmm. Anything you would add to that, Tony?
Well, there's sort of a interesting way to to involve teams. Sometimes you can do it during like when you're having social events and stuff, which is for us again harder because everything we do is online. But giving people that forum, one of the ways we do it is one-on-one meetings that we have we're probably going to do it twice a year. Just like turn the thing the other way and let people kind of say what they think as part of their own review process, so like a two-way thing. And I think that kind of sets the tone for like, you don't always get to complain, but you do sometimes, like the difference between complaints and like, your suggestions, because all of it can be taken in context, right? Like if someone maybe is a bad employee at heart and they only hate everything, then their feedback will probably be negative about everything. You have to take that away from maybe they're that way because you made them that way because you weren't managing them well, or maybe they just don't count, or there's maybe somebody else who never opens their mouth, but they are thinking 100 things. And I mean, that's the way we do it with customers. We usually assume that the only people that fill out the comment cards are usually the mad ones, right? It's like you almost have to, and even then, not sometimes. Like you just don't get that many people that sounds like a good idea. I'm going to communicate everything I'm thinking to you guys, because I'm sure you're going to listen to every word and turn it into the policy here in the company. So I guess you just got to encourage that kind of communication, I think, so that you can get those nuggets when needed, like not, like I said, when they're leaving, right. After they're on their way out, tell you all the stuff they were going to, if you would have asked me while I was working here still, I would have told you blah, blah, blah.
And sometimes people need to be asked. I actually think that is a general construct that we might go into our next role and we might have these really big aspirations, yet for the way that the work is done here, it doesn't always line up. And that invitation becomes necessary to make sure it's like, oh, well, there might be some dissonance here. We still want to hear from you. To Tony, your point, before you're walking out the door. Because if you're a good employee, we want to keep you. And that kind of conversation helps us do that. Now, I can't believe how fast the time has gone by. And actually, I can. It happens to me all the time, just wrapped up in really good conversations with really smart, amazing people. And so before we start winding down today, I do want to create a space for, based off of the conversation that we've had, is there something that has bubbled up that belongs in the conversation, even if we're past that point in the talk so far, that should be said now because it belongs here?
Jess, I think your point about wanting to get information is a really good one. And I just ride on the back of your thought there, and by saying, a typical human response to feedback. Well, let me put it this way. In my younger years, when I used to run face-to-face workshops, at the end of the day, I'd have the evaluation sheets. Okay, and so I don't know if people have ever reflected on what happens to those evaluation sheets, because I tell you what happens. As soon as the last participant leaves the room, the person who's been running the show, in this case me, collects all those evaluation sheets, and that's the first thing you do, start flicking through them, right, to see what people have said. And here's what used to happen for me. I'd read a comment, it would say, fantastic, Steve, best program I've ever been on, terrific, brilliant, this is the best, brilliant. This was the worst program I've ever been on, you bloody idiot. And then I'd go to the next one, right? So I'm sharing this because the natural human reaction to feedback that's less than positive is to discount their view as being wrong or irrelevant, okay? There's this feedback resistance meter that we all have to negative feedback. So if it's one thing that leaders, I think, need to tune into, it is, how are you receiving feedback that's less than positive? Are you in denial? Are you in justification mode? Are you sort of in some way rejecting the validity of that person's response? Because that's going to create some UGRs for your future. If you're denying, if you're justifying, then the UGR is there's no point in sharing the information with them, because they're not really that interested in it, right? So I think that's a critical thing, and it's a self-reflection thing that needs to happen, I think, for all leaders.
How about you, Tony? Any last things that have bubbled up that didn't really have a place, yet it would make sense to say them for our conversation today?
I think that, just in summary, that it's more important than you think. It took me a while to understand this. And if you don't think it's a big deal, then you'll learn the hard way.
And even if you think it's a big deal, you're still going to learn the hard way.
Yes. Even if you do it all perfectly, that won't actually be perfect.
I hope it's a little less hard, but there are things that we think we're to the point of something that, Steve said earlier, where as long as we're constructive and we're driven by good intent, we can still end up with a blind spot here or there that will not hurt as bad because we've got other good support, to your point, Tony. And, I could keep talking to both of you about this for days. We could go on and on and on. And for all of our listeners, all of our watchers, this is the BOLd Business Podcast, and we're talking about culture, improving our culture incrementally so that we can have, I was going to say chasmic, but that didn't sound very good. I was thinking about jumping the chasm, and I think there was probably a better word than that. But now that you understand the same visual, being like Indiana Jones, really, and just going right across that big valley with the alligators underneath, knowing you'll get to the other side somehow, that's what we're talking about with culture. And that's what we get in terms of the results. More than we could have dreamed, better than we thought. It's never hopeless either. So thank you for stopping by, watching, and listening. Go to reddirection.com to subscribe on your platform of choice to listen to all of our programs, and make sure you stay tuned on what we've been doing on social media so that you can connect directly with Steve and with Tony to continue the conversation that we are having to support where you are in your business. Hey, and make sure to tell a friend about us. Somebody you know is dealing with this stuff right now, share this program with them. That is my one ask of you. And with that, I want to say thanks, and until